Varig Flight 254 was a Boeing 737-241 CN 216-398 registration PPVMK on a scheduled passenger flight from São Paulo, Brazil, to Belém, Pará, Brazil, with several intermediate stopovers on 3 September 1989. Prior to takeoff from Maraba, Pará, towards the final destination, a crew entered an incorrect heading into the flight computer. Instead of flying towards its destination, the plane flew due west and after some time was over a remote area of the Amazon jungle. Attempts to reach an alternative airport were unsuccessful, and the plane eventually ran out of fuel. The pilot made a belly landing in the jungle, 1,050 miles northwest of Rio de Janeiro. There were 54 occupants on board, 48 passengers and a crew of 6. 13 passengers died, and many more sustained serious injuries. The survivors were rescued 2 days later. Summary: early moments of the flight. The flight was a scheduled service from São Paulo to Belém with stopovers in Uberaba, Uberlândia, Goiânia, Brasília, Imperatriz, Maraba, and finally Belém. The São Paulo-Belém route had an approximate duration of 8 hours and 20 minutes. At 9:43, Flight 254 left Guarulhos International Airport, São Paulo, heading towards Belém. The flight crew consisted of 32-year-old Captain Cesar Augusto Padula Garce, First Officer Nilson da Souza Zil, 29, and 4 flight attendants. The flight went smoothly through all the stops, and at 17:20, a crew was arranging the final preparations at Maraba Airport while the passengers were boarding. Incident: while First Officer Zil was making an external inspection of the aircraft, Captain Garce consulted the flight plan for the magnetic heading to Belém. The flight plan read 0270. Garce interpreted this as 270 degrees, but the intended meaning was 027.0 degrees. Varig's heading notation for the flight plan was changed to 4 digits from 3 while Garce was on vacation, and it did not explicitly specify the position for the decimal point, which was implicitly located to the left of the rightmost digit. That confusion was the primary cause for the disaster, along with other minor errors. The captain therefore set the left side horizontal situation indicator to 270 degrees i.e. due west course. This heading is clearly inconsistent with the route from Maraba to Belém. After setting the HSI, Garce programmed the aircraft performance management system to the distance to Belém. The flight plan indicated an altitude of 29,000 feet and a leg duration of 48 minutes. When co-captain Zil got to his seat, instead of checking his own flight plan to adjust his HSI, as he was required to do, he only referenced the captain's indicator and set his to match it. At 17:45, Flight 254 took off from Maraba, and the autopilot started along 158 degrees curve to port. Instead of the 41 degrees heading turn to starboard that should be expected during a normal flight to Belém. It is reported that the mistake may have been due in part to the crew listening to a Brazil v Chile World Cup football qualifying match on the radio. When Garce believed the aircraft to be close to the destination, he attempted to use his VHF radio to communicate with Belém Tower. Failing to do so directly, he used another Varig airliner operating flight RG-266 as a radio relay to talk to Belém Airport. When Garce managed to establish communications with Belém, he requested descent clearance, and received it. Upon performing performing his descent. The captain found it very odd that he could not recognize any of the characteristic geographical features of the Belém area, and even asked the tower controller if the city was without electricity. In 1989, Belém Airport still had no radar, and so the controller informed Flight 254 that it was the only one in its airspace, and gave it landing clearance. After the PMS started indicating negative distance to its destination, Captain Garcia decided to execute a 180-degree turn and locate Belém visually. He also descended the aircraft to 4,000 feet and reduced its speed to 200 knots. Reluctant to use the HF radio to request help, the captain decided to take visual reference from a river he located below the plane, believing it to be the Amazon. The river was actually the Xingu, which runs chiefly south-north, while the Amazon runs west-east. At the time, the flight had already taken 30 minutes longer than scheduled, and the passengers were getting anxious. When First Officer Zil finally noticed their initial mistake, he and the captain decided, after checking the navigation charts, to make contact with Santarém Airport, and made an almost 180-degree turn, now establishing a 350 magnetic course. After some calculations, Garcia realized that the aircraft did not have the necessary fuel to reach Santarém, and he started heading south again. Finally, he decided to contact Miraba Airport again, to find his location. The radio frequency of Goiânia locator was the same as Maraba's, and Garcia tuned to Goiânia's locator south of Miraba. The captain was already nervous, and unfortunately he failed to notice that the tuned locator's Morse code identifier was not consistent with Maraba's beacon. At 20:05, Belém Center called Flight 254 again demanding a report. The captain stated that he had a 170 magnetic heading to Miraba, and that he was receiving a bearing from the Carajás beacon. Garcia was perplexed when Belém informed him that the Carajás locator had been shut down since 1930, and the center decided to try and illuminate the Carajás runway in an attempt to facilitate Flight 254's orientation. Realizing that he would not have enough fuel to reach Belém, the captain decided to head for Carajás Airport, which would have been the correct decision if he had not mistaken Goiânia for Miraba. In another stroke of bad luck, Flight 254 passed, at approximately 100 nautical miles away from the Serra de Cachimbo Air Force Base, a very large airfield which the 737 could have successfully reached. After that, it was inevitable that the aircraft would have to make a forced landing over the rainforest in the north of Mato Grosso. At the time, there were no written procedures for such an emergency situation. Garcia and Zil decided to fly at 8,000 feet until they ran out of fuel, thus avoiding a possible explosion upon landing, and with the engines on, they would still have hydraulic power to command the aircraft. They also decided to keep the plane flying slightly above stall speed, which in this case was around 150 knots. During the descent, they spotted very few lights through the jungle. At 20:40, Garcia informed Belém Center that he would be making a forced landing over the jungle, and when he had 15 minutes left of fuel, he informed his passengers of the situation. When there was around 100 kilograms of fuel remaining, the left engine stopped. The right engine ran for a further 2 minutes, and then stopped as well. Even after shutdown, the engines were still windmilling. This gave the airplane some rudimentary and unreliable hydraulic control, but was better than having no power at all. Garcia commanded the lowering of the flaps, which only moved to position 2 due to the failing hydraulic system. With the batteries discharged, there was no electrical power, and the only 4 instruments working in the cockpit were the artificial horizon horizon. The altimeter, the airspeed indicator and the vertical speed indicator. The only thing the crew could see on the horizon were faint light spots due to distant forest burnings, and at 21:06 local time, the plane crash-landed over treetops that extended over 50 meters above ground. The deceleration due to the crash was such that passengers without fastened seat belts were flung to the front of the airplane, and some seats detached from the floor, also racing forward. When the aircraft fell through the foliage, two thick trees tore away both wings, and caused a severe torsion of the fuselage, which contributed to more seats detaching, and to the collapsing of the false roof over the passengers' heads. After its speed slowed to about 35 knots, the aircraft ran for little more than 30 meters and stopped, lying on its right side. Aftermath: 2 days later, 4 of the survivors decided to try to walk and look for help. After about 2 or 3 hours of walking in the jungle, a group led by Alfonso Saraiva found the house of the Curunare farm in São José de Zingu. That farm had no radio, so they were taken by car to another farm, Serrao da Prata, at 12:30 Tuesday. With the help of radio operator João Capanema Jr., they were able to contact Franca Airport, and at 16:27 of that Tuesday, an EMB Bandeirante airplane from the Brazilian Air Force dropped food packages over the wreckage. By 12 o'clock Wednesday, all survivors had been rescued by the FAB.